Welcome to part 1 of my Lake Erie bike loop series. This video covers the first 5 days of my 10-day bike trip riding around Lake Erie. In this first installment, I'll be riding from Niagara Falls, Ontario along the south shore of Lake Erie to Sandusky, Ohio, where I'll then catch a ferry to Pelee Island, Ontario. On this trip, I'll be riding my linear limo recumbent bike loaded with waterproof panniers and a small tent and sleeping pad. My journey began on Saturday, July 27, 2019 at my home in downtown Toronto. I made my way through the streets of Toronto down to Union Station, where I caught the 9 a.m. Niagara Falls excursion train provided by GO Transit. Because there are so many cyclists which take advantage of this special weekend service, they provide train cars which have bike racks on the lower level. This is my first time taking this train, and I enjoyed the new scenery. At 11:15 a.m. the train arrived at Niagara Falls Station, and day 1 of my trip began. From Niagara Falls, I'll cross into the United States and follow the Niagara River over to Grand Island and then into Buffalo. From Buffalo, I'll join the Lake Erie Shoreline and ride to Irving State Park for my first night of camping. From the train station, I made my way to the Rainbow Bridge and enjoyed the view of the falls while I waited in line to cross the international border. Despite the fact that I was traveling by bicycle, the border agent just checked my passport, asked me standard questions, and allowed me to enter the United States of America. While I was in the area, I decided to check out the view of the falls from the American side, since I've only ever viewed them from Canada. The falls on the left are the Horseshoe Falls, and the ones to the right of the Rainbow Bridge are the American Falls. When standing right next to the falls, there's a lot of mist in the air, and I can see a rainbow. This viewing area for the falls is on Goat Island, so after I was finished sightseeing, I crossed back onto the mainland and joined the bike path along the Niagara River. Further upstream, I crossed a much larger bridge, which took me to Grand Island. Grand Island has a size of approximately 73 square kilometers and a population of about 20,000. The path from the bridge led me to a road with a wide paved shoulder, which took me across the island to the bridges at the other end. Both sets of bridges were a significant climb, but I had a really nice view from the middle overlooking the Niagara River. At the other end of the bridge, I joined the bike path and rode until it came to an unexpected dead end. After backtracking a bit, I found my way onto some neighborhood streets and rode towards downtown Buffalo. This street is called Niagara Street, and a portion of it was closed for a local street festival. At the very center of Buffalo is Niagara Square. I noticed that Buffalo has a small bike share system which uses these social bikes which have a drive shaft rather than a chain. I also noticed these Buffalo pedal tour vehicles, one that was parked and one that was being ridden. By 2:30 p.m. I had ridden more than 50 kilometers and was feeling quite hungry, so I stopped at a place called Carbone's Pizza and Subs. Since I'm in Buffalo, I ordered their chicken wings, which came with fries and a tiny bag of carrots. As I continued riding east, I passed Tesla's Gigafactory 2, which manufactures photovoltaic cells. Riding through a combination of residential and industrial land, I eventually reached the Lake Erie Shoreline. Looking back at the Buffalo skyline, I can see the Steelwind's 35 megawatt wind project in the foreground. The fact that only half of the turbines are spinning indicates the wind is blowing, but not very strongly right now. However, as I'm riding west, I can certainly feel that wind is against me. But with a temperature greater than 30 degrees Celsius, the heat and humidity today is a much bigger factor, so I certainly appreciate these occasional patches of shade. At around 5:45 p.m., I arrived at the entrance to Irving State Park. After checking in at the gatehouse, I set up my tent at my campsite and then made my way down to the water to cool off from the lake. I arrived at the beach just as the swimming area was closing, so I instead headed back to swim at the water directly adjacent to the campground. This area isn't sandy at all, and instead has these flat sedimentary rock shelves. I carefully made my way over the rocks until I reached deeper water where I could fully submerge myself. This is my first swim in Lake Erie since last May, and on this very hot summer day the water feels quite warm. Following my swim, I explored a bit more around the park, had a shower, and got ready to sleep as I enjoyed a beautiful sunset over the lake. After a restful sleep in my tent, I awoke the next morning to cloudy skies and a delicious serving of campsite overnight oats. As I was packing up my campsite, I felt a few light raindrops, but they didn't amount to anything, and I was on the road before 8:30 a.m. Today my ride will take me further west along the shoreline, where I'll be crossing from New York State into Pennsylvania. My destination for tonight is Erie, Pennsylvania, where I'll be staying at Lampy Campground, located near the entrance of the Erie Harbor. Near the beginning of my journey this morning, I rode through the Cattaraugus Reservation, which belongs to the Seneca Nation of Indians. I spotted this little groundhog standing up on its hind legs. The reservation had lots of big signs for gambling and tobacco. Here I'm crossing over the Cattaraugus Creek. The community on the other side is Irving, New York, and this next community where I'm passing under these railway bridges is Silver Creek, New York. My portable AM/FM radio helps me pass these long hours on the road by listening to local radio stations. Located within the community of Dunkirk, this is the Dunkirk Generating Station, which is a retired coal-fired power plant. On these trips I usually end up seeing a lot of dead animals on the side of the road, but this is my first time ever seeing an entire adult deer carcass left behind. Today is another really hot and humid day, and by noon I nearly consumed all 4 of my water bottles and was ready for a stop in Barcelona, New York. This is the Barcelona Lighthouse, built in 1829. I stopped for lunch at the Barcelona Cafe and ordered their breakfast scrambler, which was really tasty. After getting all of my water bottles topped off, I got back on the road and continued riding. Up ahead where you can see the pavement change color is the state line. I've now officially entered the state of Pennsylvania. As I've been riding, I've noticed a lot of these enormous vineyards. The temperature today feels even hotter than yesterday, and my clothes are completely soaked in sweat. Eventually I reached the city limits of Erie, PA, and made my way towards my campground. Before checking in, I decided to ride out to the end of the harbor pier, which is adjacent to the campground. After a very hot, sweaty day, a swim in the lake was very tempting, but unfortunately there were signs saying it wasn't allowed here. So I proceeded to my campsite where I pitched my tent and hung up my wet shirt to dry. In the evening I got back on my bike and made my way into Erie's downtown area. One of my all-time favorite movies, That Thing You Do, was set in Erie, PA, but unfortunately I don't believe any parts of it were actually filmed here, and the streetscape looks nothing like the movie. I usually prefer to eat at independent restaurants, but decided to eat at Arby's tonight since this restaurant chain seems to be gradually disappearing in Canada. On my ride back to the campground, I stopped at the Erie waterfront as this old sailboat was passing. The land you can see across the harbor is Presque Isle State Park, which is a long peninsula. Although quite a different city, I noticed a lot of similarities in the natural formation of the Erie Harbor with the Toronto Harbor. Back at the campsite I could see a nice sunset as I got ready to sleep. Unfortunately those beautiful clouds turned into a violent thunderstorm at bedtime, but it only lasted for about an hour. I awoke the next morning at 6:15 and my tent was already completely dry. After my usual breakfast I got packed up and was on the road riding by 8 a.m. So on day 3 I'll be continuing west and crossing into the state of Ohio. Tonight I'll be camping at Geneva State Park, which is very close to Geneva-On-The-Lake, Ohio. The beginning of my journey was along the Erie waterfront where there's a nice separated bike path. Near the edge of the city it turned into bike lanes and eventually a paved shoulder. I've been following the Pennsylvania bike route Z since yesterday, and it's given me a lot of safe roads to ride on. For the 3rd day in a row I'm fighting against the wind from the west, so I decided to adjust my seat to its most reclined position to maximize the aerodynamic advantage of my recumbent bike. The change in the color of asphalt ahead marks the state line. So I've now entered the state of Ohio, which from a first impression doesn't seem to be as bike friendly as Pennsylvania was. The first community I reached in Ohio was called Conneaut. I stopped at a grocery store in Conneaut to buy some apples and also refill my water bottles. Today is another very hot and humid day, and I've been consuming a lot of water. Outside of Conneaut, the lakefront roadway was very quiet and peaceful. I'm now entering the city of Ashtabula, which has a population of about 18,000. This community was first settled in 1803 and has served as a major harbor for transporting coal and iron ore. I decided to stop for lunch at a place called Rennick's Meat Market. Incidentally, I ended up ordering a Mexican torta, which is made from refried beans and doesn't actually contain meat. After lunch, I rode to this lookout point where I could see the lift bridge where I crossed the Ashtabula River closing. Also spanning the river is this large coal ramp, which is used for transferring coal from railway cars into large cargo ships on Lake Erie. Ashtabula had a nice, quaint, historic small-town feeling, and I enjoyed my brief visit. I proceeded west and eventually reached this nice stretch of roadway with a beautiful view of the lake. I soon approached the community of Geneva-On-The-Lake, which has been a popular tourist destination since the early 1900s. Just beyond there I entered Geneva State Park, which is where I'll be camping tonight. I arrived at my campsite by 3:15, and before setting up camp I decided to ride down to Breakwater Beach for a swim to cool off. There were lots of people out enjoying the nice big sandy beach. In the distance I could see a big cargo ship out in the lake. Since I had arrived at my destination so early today, and I didn't have a chance to swim yesterday, I took an extra long swim today. Back at the campground there was a bit of light rain as I was setting up the tent, but it didn't amount to anything. At 5:45 I got back on my bike and spotted a deer running across the roadway as I made my way back to Geneva-On-The-Lake for dinner. There's a nice paved bike path to get there, and down the shoreline I can see the Ashtabula harbor. For dinner I stopped at Eddie's Grill, where they've been selling hot dogs and root beer since 1949. I also stopped at Madsen Donuts, which has been here since 1938. On my ride back to the campsite I noticed some dark clouds in the sky, but thankfully I was able to shower and get ready to sleep before the heavy rain started. After a night of intermittent rain, I awoke to dry skies the next morning. After breakfast I got my gear packed and loaded and headed out of the campground. So my route for day 4 will initially take me south in favor of quieter roads further inland, but I'll then work my way back towards the shoreline as I approach the suburbs of Cleveland. Tonight I won't be camping and instead will stay at the Cleveland Hostel in the Ohio City neighborhood of Cleveland. Unfortunately, just as I was leaving, the rain started up and it was coming down really hard, so I pulled out my rain jacket. It rained pretty solidly for about an hour and a half, but luckily all of my stuff was tightly sealed up inside my waterproof panniers. Eventually the rain stopped and here I'm crossing over the Grand River. I found this interesting because there's another Grand River on the Canadian side which also flows into Lake Erie. As I approached Cleveland I passed through the suburban cities of Mentor, East Lake, Willowick, and Euclid. But here now I'm entering the city limits of Cleveland. I typically stop for lunch each day around the 60 or 70 kilometer mark, but today those marks came during a long stretch of residential neighborhoods with no restaurants in sight. Here I'm riding along the Cleveland waterfront and can see the city's skyline coming into view. Cleveland's airport is right beside the water, and just beyond there is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I visited with my family as a teenager. From there I rode through the downtown area towards my hostel. Built in 1930, this building is called Terminal Tower. To get to Ohio City, I took this bridge across the Cuyahoga River. I considered stopping somewhere for lunch, but decided to just check into my hostel first. At the Cleveland Hostel, my accommodation for tonight is a bed in a shared 6-person bunk bed room, though only one of the other beds is actually full tonight. After doing some unpacking, I headed back outside to explore more of the city and find myself some lunch. This time I took a different bridge across the river, which had another great view of the city, and also took me right past Progressive Field, where Cleveland's Major League Baseball team plays. While riding through Cleveland State University, I saw this unexpected sight. These 2 deer somehow got lost wandering around Cleveland. On my bike trips I have a tradition of always eating Thai food at least once, so I rode to an area known as Asia Town where I stopped to eat at a place called Map of Thailand. I ordered their massaman curry, which tasted extra good since it was now 4:15 and I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. Afterwards I rode to the waterfront where I'd entered the city and then rode south through Rockefeller Park, which has a nice bike path beside Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. Heading back on Euclid Avenue, I saw the world's largest outdoor chandelier. After passing right through Cleveland's downtown, I decided to check out an area known as the Irish Town Bend. Back in the 1960s, the Cuyahoga River used to be so badly polluted that it would periodically catch on fire, but they've come a long way since then. This barge is operated by St. Mary's Cement and is delivering a big load to their Cleveland terminal just up the river. Last summer I rode through St. Mary's, Ontario, where that company first got started. After waiting for this lift bridge to close, I headed back to my hostel and checked out their rooftop patio. I decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood, and since I had such a late lunch, I decided to jump straight to dessert for my evening meal. Mitchell's Homemade Ice Cream makes their product right here in this building, and I decided to order their Cleveland Brownie Sundae, which of course was delicious. After getting ready for bed and getting most of my gear packed up, I found this guitar in the common area of the hostel. You never count your money, why sitting at the table, I played for a while, but then went back to my room to get an early sleep in my bed. After a short but very comfortable sleep, I awoke the next morning at 4:30 a.m. I enjoyed my usual overnight oats breakfast, then retrieved my bike from the storage area in the hostel's basement. My bike was loaded and I was on the road by 5:30 a.m. Today on day 5 I'll be riding west through the Cleveland suburbs and continuing to follow the shoreline of Lake Erie to Sandusky, Ohio. From Sandusky I'll then catch a ferry which will take me halfway across Lake Erie to Pelee Island. My reason for getting such an early start today is because the ferry company only has one ferry per day, and I want a big buffer of time to help ensure I won't miss it. The beginning of my ride was in full darkness, but within an hour there was daylight. I passed several cyclists riding in the opposite direction who were presumably commuting to jobs in the city. I'm now passing through the city of Lorain, Ohio, and crossing over the Black River. As I was approaching the city of Vermilion, I could see some dark clouds in the sky. In Vermilion, almost every telephone pole I saw had an American flag hung. On the radio this morning, I've been listening to the Cleveland NPR station. After 4 hours on the road and 75 kilometers ridden, when I reached the city of Huron, I was feeling quite hungry. I stopped at Berardi's family restaurant and ordered their country breakfast, which consisted of eggs with sausage gravy and biscuits. It was really tasty, and the sausage gravy kind of reminded me of chowder. On my way out of Huron, I followed a trail which commemorates the Lakeshore Electric Railway, which once spanned from Cleveland to Detroit. I've been noticing the temperature hasn't been quite so hot today, which is a welcome change. When I reached Sandusky, I proceeded straight to the waterfront where the ferry terminal is. I arrived at around 11:30, and my ferry doesn't actually leave until 3:30, but I was really glad to have such a big buffer of time this morning in case something went wrong with my bike along the way. The ferry terminal is currently under construction, so I decided to spend some time exploring around Sandusky and eventually found my way to the public library, which has free public Wi-Fi. I also stopped to pick up a few things at the grocery store, then made my way back to the harbor and watched the ferry pull in. The Pelee Islander was built in 1960 in Erie, Ontario. On this ferry, all vehicles including bikes are loaded by the ferry staff through the side of the boat. We pulled away from the dock on schedule and made our way out of the Sandusky harbor. In the distance I can see someone parasailing, and behind them is Cedar Point. First opening in 1870, Cedar Point is the second oldest amusement park in the USA. It has a total of 72 rides, including 17 roller coasters, and the ferry went right past it before making its way into the open waters of Lake Erie. Having spent the past 9 days traveling adjacent to this lake, it's a neat experience now getting to travel across it. There are several islands near the west end of the lake, including this one called Put-in Bay, and this one called Kelly's Island. The ferry ride from Sandusky to Pelee Island takes about 2 hours and costs $13.75 plus $6.50 to bring a bicycle. This island up ahead is called Middle Island, and it's a Canadian island. Given that the international border is just 150 meters south of it, Middle Island is the most southern point of land in all of Canada. The entire island is a conservation area, so it's not inhabited by any humans. Just beyond Middle Island, however, is Pelee Island, which is much larger and contains the southernmost populated point in all of Canada. Pelee Island has a year-round population of approximately 235 people, but during the summer it can swell to over 1,500 people. After showing my passport to the Canada Customs officials, I made my way onto the island and proceeded towards the municipal campground. It feels great to be back in Canada, and the roads on this island couldn't be any more quiet and peaceful. At 6 p.m. I arrived at Pelee Island's East Park campground, which of course is Canada's southernmost campground. After registering for a campsite, I dropped off some of my stuff, then proceeded to the nearby beach for a quick dip in the lake. The beach was very sandy, and there were some really big waves, which made for a really fun swim. Afterwards I returned to my campsite to set up my tent, then got back on my bike to explore up to the north end of the island. Since I'm planning on catching a 9 a.m. ferry tomorrow morning, I want to see as much of the island as possible during my short visit here. At the north end there's a trail to the Pelee Island Lighthouse, but unfortunately it's closed right now due to the high water levels in the lake. Along the north shore there's a marina, and also the Pelee Island Public School, which typically has a student population between 10 and 20 students. When I wrapped around to the west side of the island, I could see the Pelee Islander 2 ferry heading towards the Ontario shore. This field contains the Pelee Island Airport. Eventually I reached the ferry dock where I had arrived at the island and stopped at the Westview Tavern for some late night dinner. From here I had a great view to watch the red sun disappearing into the lake. Since I arrived at the restaurant just before they were closing, my menu options were limited, but both my shrimp and Caesar salad tasted great. After dinner I completed my full loop around the island as the sky turned to dark. Today I rode a total of 150 kilometers, which is the furthest distance I've ever ridden on a recumbent bike in a single day, and a great milestone to mark the completion of the first half of my 10-day trip. Stay tuned for the second half of this video series, where over the next 5 days I'll make my way back to Niagara Falls along the Canadian side of Lake Erie. If you watched all the way to the end of the video, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.